GPS. Part 2.
Returning to the car, Barry dipped his headlights for a moment, so that they were just looking up towards a black skyline of trees. Knowing what was going to come next, Rehan was smashed by a fresh wave of panic. "Okay, Barry, that's it. Let's go to the police now. We can tell them all about Mark. I won't leave anything out." "No," said Barry, shaking his head. "We're going to keep going, Rehan. I don't care if you're not happy with that." "It's just a fucking glitch," said Rehan, hitting the dashboard like a spoilt child. "All you've done is put your phone into some kind of konami fucking cheat mode. It doesn't mean anything. We've got to go." "No," said Barry firmly. "You got us into this shit, and now you're going to help us get out of it. But if you don't have the guts to do that, then fine, get out of the car and walk back to Lidcombe." Rehan peered out the window, as if he was surveying rising floodwaters. He looked feebly back at Barry. "Right then, that's your answer." Barry dropped the handbrake and shifted his car into gear. The car lunged forward and began climbing up the hill. Glancing in his mirror, Barry was relieved to see that the gate hadn't automatically closed. But the moment the car was out of sight, a mechanism clicked in the gate, and it began to slide back over the rails, cutting off the boys in the cemetery from the sleeping suburb of Lidcombe. It wasn't the rickety road you'd find in an old crappy horror film. It was new and sealed, at odds with the age of some of the gravestones, which were crumbly, covered in a red rust, sticking out like buck teeth in the surrounding grounds. But Barry was trying not to look around, concentrating only on his driving. It would be embarrassing to crash in a place where the speed limit was only 15 kilometers an hour. As they drove into the cemetery, Rehan was beginning to regain something of himself, and even though he wasn't saying much, he was at least sitting up more alert. Barry looked over at him. "Thanks for staying, Rehan. I know you're scared. You are probably right about us checking all of this out, even if it means that we lost Mark. But this is definitely a very strange thing." His friend didn't say anything. "I guess I just wanted to go to the party because of Carly. I just couldn't stand the thought of David Grogan hooking up with her. But it was pretty selfish of me." Barry looked straight ahead. He felt better to be saying this, and something in him also felt strangely excited. Perhaps this is how Rehan had felt when the location had first come up. "Hey, and I'm sorry for being angry with you." "It's alright," said Rehan in a soft voice. "I was acting like a dickhead anyway." "No, you weren't, and I don't think I would have had the guts to walk back to Lidcombe either." And the moment the words left his mouth, Barry realised they weren't true. He could have easily have walked back, but it had helped his friend to feel better, and that had been his real intention, even if he didn't know it. "Hey, what's this tsunami code?" "Konami code," corrected Rehan. "It's a Nintendo cheat code." He squinted at Barry. "How come you don't know about that?" "I didn't have a Nintendo," said Barry, shaking his head. "You know how my dad was sick a lot." "Yeah," Rehan nodded. "Well, it just meant that my parents had to be tight with money. It's not like we were poor or anything. We still had piano lessons and went to scouts, but we just didn't get any stuff like that." "It's cool. I understand," said Rehan, now feeling guilty about all the things his dad had brought him back from Singapore. "Well," he explained, "this cheat code only worked with Konami games, and to get it to work you would have to press a sequence of buttons on the controller. Up, up, down, down, left, right, and then the B button, then the A button, and that would put whatever game you were playing into the cheat mode." Rehan glanced out the window. "But now it's stupid," he said, beginning to sound like his old cynical self again. "The Konami code has become like a sort of in-joke with programmers. Those Silicon Valley guys are always hiding shit and everything, and all you need to do sometimes is just randomly put in the Konami code and it will unlock some secret feature in whatever app you are using." "Really?" said Barry. "Do you think that's what's happened?" "Well, I don't know," said Rehan. "You could have accidentally pressed some special sequence of buttons, but it doesn't have to be the Konami code. It could be something like it. But I don't really remember you guys pressing much, and I can't imagine it happening in a major app like your GPS. It's using Google Maps data, and they're a proper company." "Yes, I guess they are," said Barry, looking admiringly at his friend. "You can't help but be a smartass, can you, Rehan?" "No, I probably can't," he grinned, and felt something in his wall of fear loosen.
At the next roundabout, take the second exit onto Necropolis Drive.
They drove past the Holocaust Memorial at the top of the hill before the road dipped down again on the other side, the car headlights revealing an avenue lined with squat palm trees and the occasional yellow mausoleum.
At the next intersection, turn right.
"What intersection?" said Barry. He couldn't see anything, just rows and rows of headstones beyond the palm trees. He checked his mirror. Maybe he had passed it accidentally, but the hill and the horizon behind him had melded into one black lump, and it was difficult to make anything out. Now even he was beginning to feel afraid. Then the intersection that the GPS was referring to came into view. On the left-hand corner was a closed-up flower stall, the car headlights sweeping over a hand-painted fresh flowers sign propped up against the wall. Barry took the slowest right-hand turn of his life. As the car was shoring up in this new direction, a wisp of orange light jumped up through a cluster of pine trees about 200 metres ahead of them. Rehan leant forward. "Did you see that?" "Yeah, I saw it," said Barry. They rolled slowly forward in the car. Then the light came again, and there could be no mistaking that dynamic, haphazard dance of fire. Barry stopped the car. "Do you think—" "Shh," for a moment, said Barry, and switched off the headlights. For a minute they watched in silence, as an orange light flickered through the trees. "Something's caught on fire," said Barry, finally. "Someone's lit a candle on a grave, left, and now it has grown into something bigger." He rolled his bottom lip against his top lip, back and forth, as he thought. "I guess if we don't do anything, it could turn into a bushfire." "Yeah, but it's not like we'd be killing anyone," said Rehan, unable to help himself, even in a soft voice, joking. "Yes, I know," said Barry, playing along. "Everyone's already dead, ha, Rehan. But you know, people sometimes do insurance jobs on factories at night, and they don't realise some homeless person is sleeping in there, and they end up killing them by accident." "This is not a factory," said Rehan, "and I don't think any homeless people would want to come and sleep in a cemetery." "Well, maybe you're right," said Barry. "Then it could just be some dickheads like us pissing up, and if it is, then we'll leave them alone and go back home." Barry snapped his phone out of its holder and slid it into his back pocket. Then the two of them climbed out of the car as quietly as possible, gently pushing the doors in so that they clicked shut but didn't lock. The sky had cleared and they could see the stars above them, shining more brightly than usual. Nobody used street directories anymore, but if the boys had had one, they would have been able to see just how big Haslam's Creek Cemetery really was. It took up the whole page of a map, bigger than many of the nearby suburbs, and the boys were right in the middle of it. Not that they could visibly see that. Trees rose up in all directions, lone pines, native gum trees, crazy monkey puzzles, gnarled bushes and wild scrub, all obscuring the horizon. The two boys left the tarmac road for an overgrown path of weeds and crabgrass to sneak down. The headstones on either side of them were not from this century or the century before it, but the century before that one, a colonial time that had refused to etch itself on the imagination of the boys, no matter how many times their teachers had tried to teach them about it. They could hear the crackle of timber. Glancing at each other, they kept along the path, edging nearer to this brightly lit grove of trees, and then when the flames came finally into view, a weird chill ran through Barry. It was bringing back an old fear. When Barry was about 12, he had gone through a weird phase where he had become afraid of anything to do with Satanism and witchcraft. Though it was not like he was brought up to be religious. His parents took he and his two brothers to church, only once in a blue moon, just so they knew what it was all about. No, the fear had not come from the church directly. It was more likely that it had started out at school, from what he used to hear from other kids. That if you played heavy metal records backwards, you would hear all of these secret messages, possibly from the devil, telling you to do terrible things, like burn down your school or kill someone. But while visiting a family friend from Scotland, the boy of the family friend, who was a couple of years older than Barry and his brothers, had played them heavy metal records by the English band Iron Maiden. and as Barry had listened to the music, he had become mesmerised by it, as a whole new world opened up to him. The guitar chords sounded brilliantly futuristic, like a bright light, and the harmonies of the songs and the lyrics transported his mind to somewhere completely new. And the moment he became aware that he was actually enjoying it, a thought came into his mind that if he continued to listen to this, he might just end up going to hell. But something in him then decided that this was in fact a risk worth taking. This music was just too good to ignore. After going home, he found a nearby music shop that had the album on cassette. The man who owned the shop allowed him to pay it off week by week, $2 at a time, until finally it was Barry's, and he could take it home and listen to it, over and over again, gazing over the fold-out sleeve, looking for details hidden in the art, and mimicking the futuristic font that the song lyrics were written in, until finally he had permanently altered his handwriting. But still, he always hovered on the edge of being afraid, and a few times he managed to scare himself at night, recording a heavy metal show from the local community radio station and hearing a voice saying, "Let me out, let me out, let me out," over and over again. After playing it to a school friend the next day who couldn't hear it, Barry soon realised that it was just the repetitive scraping noise that one of the tape spindles on his cassette player was making, and he felt greatly relieved. He eventually moved on from heavy metal to other types of music, and he also came to understand how many of these earlier fears had been part of a wider hysteria that had been whipped up by fearful parent groups, egged on by a media not doing its job properly, and so they no longer held any power over him, or so he thought, as here they were all again, louder and brighter than ever, this time not imagined images on the back of his eyelids in the darkness of his room, but real flesh and blood people moving in the darkness in front of him. It was a natural grove of casuarinas, in which was a clearing where the lawn had been mowed, and where most of the trees in the cemetery were crooked, these ones went straight up. Nestled at the edge of the circle was a solitary family crypt. Barry crept closer, going from headstone to headstone. The light became brighter and more wild, until finally it all came into view, and true to form it was like something out of an Iron Maiden song. Standing around a large bonfire was a group of naked women. At the centre of the circle was a hooded figure, crouched over something. Cast off from the fire, their shadows danced around on the white wall of the crypt. The two boys edged closer, and Barry could see that these women had dark thatches of pubic hair, and his mind was immediately taken back to his father's garage, flicking through his Mayfair magazines of beautiful women stretched out on yachts, wearing the thinnest of material underwear. He couldn't tell if they were singing or chanting, but their mouths opened and closed with glee, and a sexual image of him with the women suddenly flashed through his head. But it was too strong, and he felt like throwing up.
In 50 meters, watch out for the altar.
"Shit," whispered Barry, immediately grabbing the arse of his pants, feeling around for his phone. But before he could do anything, he was horrified to see one of the women spin round and stare in his direction. But he soon worked out that she couldn't actually see him for having stared into the bonfire for too long. "Rehan," Barry whispered, and turned around to speak to his friend. But Rehan wasn't there. Scanning the headstones around him, Barry whispered again, "Rehan! Rehan! Rehan!" But there was no sign of him. Just then, Barry felt something run over his hand, like an ant or a beetle. He pulled his hand away from the headstone he was leaning on to see something dark on his palm. For a moment he thought it was blood, and panicked, shooting his hand up into the firelight. It was a pentagram. But it was not blood, but the red dust from the headstone. "Oh God," said Barry, feeling a sliver of dirty steel pierce his heart as he frantically rubbed his hand against his clothes to get it off. He brought his hand up to the light again, and the star was gone. His strongest impulse now was to run, but he couldn't move. He was so frightened that his legs had stopped working, the way they do sometimes in dreams, when you're trying to carry out an important task. But calming him down was the rhythmic throb of blood in his ears, brought on by this fear. Looking ahead again, he could see that his friend Mark was tied to a makeshift altar at the centre of the circle. His head was lolling to one side, his eyes closed. Was he dead? Barry didn't think so. It would not have made any sense. But seeing his friend tied to this dodgy altar, made up of 3 stolen headstones, Barry's mind raced through all the possible things he could do. He thought of all the movies, books, comics he had ever seen or read, and it was instead a song that jumped into his head, Fight Fire with Fire, an early Metallica release. He knew what he needed to do, MacGyver some petrol out of his car, and with one of the graveside candle jars, make a Molotov cocktail. But before he had a chance to implement his ingenious plan, someone suddenly came screaming out from behind the family crypt.
I'm sorry, Mark. It's all my fault.
Rehan! Rehan ran straight into the circle, to the shocked surprise of the circle makers. The moment he was in full firelight, Barry realized that his friend was naked.
Oh God, Rehan, you crazy bastard.
Barry felt like laughing maniacally. He was so pleased to see his friend doing something so honourable. But with very little ceremony, the circle's hooded leader reached into the fire and drew out a flaming 4x2 and smashed Rehan in the head with it. Rehan dropped to the ground.
Shit.
Now that the circle was disrupted, Barry panicked, jumping up from behind the headstone, though he hadn't a clue what to do. Just then, his phone lit up in his pocket.
In 20 meters, throw the phone into the fire.
Now the group all turned, and they could see Barry standing there, like a thief in the night, orange light dancing over his face. The woman who had looked in his direction before turned and ran at him. Barry looked down to see that one of his fists were clenched, ready to lash out, and he felt a fresh horror run through him. I can't hit a woman, he thought. Instead, he jumped out of a path, and she went stumbling into a bush. Barry ran towards the circle, reefed his phone out of his back pocket, and threw it as hard as he could in the direction of the fire. They all stopped and watched as a whirring disc of blue light spun through the air towards the flames. It reached its mark, but instead of going in, it hit one of the safety rocks around the fire and bounced out, landing not far from where Rehan was lying knocked out. Barry turned back. The hooded man and 4 of the women lunged at him in a deranged anger. Barry did a dummy run at them, so they braced for him, but he veered off to the right at the last moment, leaping over the fire and throwing all of his weight down as he landed leading with his shoulder against the makeshift altar. The construction absorbed the impact and went hurtling sideways with both Mark and Barry surfing over the top of it as its principal arch collapsed, sending Barry rolling into the grass, Mark still haplessly tied to the top stone, suffering rope burns in silence. The blue light of the phone blinked on.
You have reached your destination.
Be prepared to die.
Hands grabbed at Barry's feet, and he could feel himself being dragged feet first into the fire, but he refused to look, knowing that if he did, his fear would probably intensify to the point of paralysis. So instead he stared at Rehan and Mark, even though they were both out cold. He tried to reach for the phone, but it was just too far away. Just then Rehan came to, and on instinct he reached for the phone. The moment his hand connected with the phone, Barry yelled out as loud as he could, "Fucking smash it, Rehan!" Rehan raised the phone up into the sky, angling it like a dagger, and then brought it down with all his might against the headstone. Phone shattered, fragments of glass flew everywhere. Rehan dropped the phone as grey smoke began to billow out of it, and then fainted. The air was filling with a disgusting smell, and Barry wondered how it could have melted so quickly, when he suddenly realised that the smell was not only coming from the phone, but from him. His leg was on fire. "Fuck!" he screamed, jerking his leg out of the flames, and bashing it against the ground until the flames had gone out. He only half registered that there was no longer any hands holding on to him, that the group had disappeared into the night, like a bunch of gutless cowards. He rolled over into a sitting position to see Mark untying himself. "Holy fuck, what was that all about?" said Mark. Rehan was still unconscious, and Barry ran over to the closed-up flower shop and grabbed a bucket from under a dripping tap. He carried it back to the grove and tipped it over Rehan. Mark, who had been helping Rehan up, suddenly sniffed at his hand.
Ugh, what's that?
His face twitched with disgust, and he waved his hand in Barry's direction.
Is that what I think it is?
Yes, said Barry, trying not to inhale too much. I think it is. Mark, you weren't in the car earlier on, but Rehan was telling me about a novel way of dealing with being attacked.
Really?
Yes, said Barry, and it looks like it partly worked. He was doing it to try and save your life, though. Rehan opened his eyes. Rehan, are you okay? Rehan nodded, looking worse for wear. Are we going to the party? No, I don't think so, said Barry. Good, said Rehan, relieved. They managed to find most of Rehan's discarded clothes and washed off all the crap, then hobbled back to the car after having poured a final bucket of water over the fire, so that it was now just a smouldering pit in the dark. But instead of going straight home, which is what they probably should have done, they pulled over at the Orioles football field, a few blocks away from Mark's house. Rehan was coiled up fast asleep in the back seat. Mark was sitting up front with Barry, talking and taking turns at finishing off the rest of the gin. I bet you David Grogan hooked up with Carly, said Barry. Yeah, maybe. But what can you do about it, said Mark. It's not really your fault, is it? No, said Barry. I did try, but you bastards just wouldn't listen to me. He looked out the window, across the oval, at the mist and the weeping willows hanging over Duck Creek. Mark swigged the gin and said, Did Rehan tell you anything about the house? Not really. Just something about seeing a man in a cupboard. He was too freaked out to say anything else. Is that what you saw? Mark nodded. It was terrible, Barry. That's what Rehan said. Seriously, he's right, said Mark. After he took off, Mark, just hold a moment. I want to hear this. I just need to take a quick piss first. Sure, said Mark. Barry opened the door and stepped out, and it suddenly hit him how drunk and sore he was. His foot was throbbing like a bastard from where he had been burnt. But overall, he didn't feel that bad. In fact, he actually felt quietly okay, like things in his life weren't so bad. He staggered a few meters away, taking a piss against a tree. Wiping his hands in the wet grass, he walked back to the car. As he reached for the door handle, he suddenly noticed a bright little white square on the gravel. He bent down to pick it up. It was a business card. He read the writing under the streetlight, and then got back in the car. Hey, do you know what? Said Barry, showing the card to Mark. This is really weird. This said Dirk Technology Solutions the other day. Mark took the business card out of Barry's hand and squinted at it by the light coming in through the window. Where'd you get it? He asked. From the shop where I got my phone fixed. Well, it says Dark, not Dirk. That's what I'm trying to say. The sign outside of their shop said Dirk Technology Solutions. I'm sure of it. You remember how Miss Bell was always going on about that Dutch explorer, the one who discovered Australia? Yeah, Dirk Hartog. Yeah, that's right. Well, that's who I was thinking of. Well, it could just be a typo on the card, said Mark. Yeah, maybe, said Barry. And he looked at the card again and threw it out the window. He took the gin bottle back from Mark, had a swig and said, So, now your turn. Tell me what you saw. Well, after Rehan knocked me over, I was just lying there, looking up. And I remember looking at the ceiling. And then I sat up and I looked forward and all the light... The next day, Senior Constable Van Newen explained what he and his offsider Constable Galloway had discovered so far, as he helped the Gaelic Section Administrator Peter Davenport get the 3 dislodged headstones back into place. We can tell you that a car's been here, said Van, and we found an old pair of boxer shorts hanging behind that crypt over there. But that's about it so far.
Hold on,
called out Constable Galloway from beside the bonfire spot. Beneath a dislodged clump of grass, she had found a partially melted phone.
This'll help. We might be able to recover the flash drive. Great work,
said Van Newen. Younger Constable smiled. Van Newen noticed a red dust on his hands from having handled the headstones, and he brushed it off in his blue pants, then immediately regretted it. He turned back to Davenport and said, It would still be better if we had some surveillance footage to go on, and they both glanced over at the orange-vested man up the ladder of the Gaelic office. Peter Davenport turned back, shaking his head. We've paid thousands to have that camera up and running, and it doesn't bloody work on the one night that we need it. Well, I doubt that it would just go off for one night, said Van Newen. But then in a quiet voice he said, but maybe you should be looking for another supplier. I've tried to, said Davenport, a tone of frustration in his voice. But the stupid committee has had this ongoing contract with the same company for over 100 years. And when I brought it up with them recently, they seemed unwilling to discuss it. It's misplaced loyalty if you ask me. Well, said Van Newen, we make most of our arrests now based on surveillance footage, so it's best to have it up and running. Yeah, thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Out of view, the orange-vested man clicked a switch at the back of the surveillance camera. He kept his eye on the test screen and waited for the familiar whir and blue light to come back on. A picture of the two police officers and Peter Davenport appeared around the black disc of the bonfire, the scene rendered in a pale two-tone light. The man unplugged his visual tester and climbed down the ladder.
It's working now,
he called out as he folded up his ladder. Thanks, said Peter, and then muttered something under his breath that sounded like for nothing, and Senior Constable Van Newen tried not to smirk. The camera technician packed away his testing equipment and climbed back into his white utility truck. There was a neat black decal on the side that said Dark Technology Solutions, underscored by the slogan, Old-fashioned know-how for a new century. He started up his truck and drove off, taking the exit by the now open flower stand, its shutter propped up, buckets of bundled carnations and lilies and Australian natives, wrapped in cellophane, crinkling in the breeze. GPS was written and produced by I.J. Wilson for the Halloween listening party, featuring the music of Irving Force, Machine Geware and G's Voorhees, Gaetalo, Dynatron, Dance with the Dead, Europaweite Aussichten, Deru, Daniel Deluxe, as well as a soundtrack composed by Kimberly, Henninger and Shawn Parke. This story is dedicated to the memory of Scott McCarthy and Bill Chowk. Thanks for listening.